So, well, it's afternoon already. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gavin. I'm from the Singapore National Eye Centre, and I'm the Clinical Director for our Reading Centre. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our implementation experience of putting AI in our National Diabetic Retinopathy Screening Program. So these are my financial interests. And just to give a brief overview, Singapore does have a national screening program. It lies within the government healthcare system. Currently it covers about 150,000 persons, but the actual screening is about 100 and 120,000 a year, so we get about 70 to 80% compliance. It's across currently 18, now 19 primary care clinics, and it's a simple telemedicine program. Digital photograph, we have a platform that sends the images to a reading center. The photos are currently read by non-physician graders, and the reports are sent back to the clinic within the same day and 90% within the same hour. Our reading center, I'm going to give you a little bit of brief preview in order to understand the challenges of implementation. We do have a two-stage grading, one with a primary grader, and the abnormal cases plus 10% of normals are then read by a secondary grader, and these then come up with a final result which determines whether it's a referable or non-referable case. When there is disagreement, it is sent up to an ophthalmologist for arbitration. So our reading report currently reads for presence or absence of diabetic retinopathy, but we also look at other things. For example, if we think it's a glaucoma suspect, whether there are any conditions present can also trigger a referral. And overall, we refer for worse than mild, or in our case, moderate or worse diabetic retinopathy. For DME suspects, those is based on the two-dimensional photograph and looking for surrogates, so it's not OCT based, as well as any other diseases that we may think is referable according to our criteria. We have validated our non-physician graders. Our Ministry of Health does require us to do quarterly audits, and based on our quarterly audits, the graders do have a sensitivity and specificity of above 90% compared to the specialist ophthalmologist who is reviewing the audit set. We have also shown that this is cost effective, and that was important in order to justify to our government that this is a program worth funding. We compared various models in our paper. Of course, one model is without any eye screening, but we do in the past have a less formal eye screening program run by family physicians. But if you look at a family physician cost time at our government polyclinics, it was more efficient to use non-physician graders and the telemedicine program, even though there were greater information technology costs setting this up. So when we wanted to integrate AI into our screening program, we had a few objectives that we needed to meet. We wanted to maintain outcomes and screening accuracy similar to our existing screening program. Obviously, we wanted to reduce the manpower required for screening, and we wanted to prove that this will provide global healthcare cost savings. If not, if the system isn't broken, why fix it? So our software that we use has been published before. I won't go very much into our results, except that it provides a sensitivity and specificity that we felt was adequate to integrate this into our program. And it also detects for glaucoma and referable AMD, which were being screened for in our program at the current moment. So the processes that we had to think about, well, firstly, we needed to enable the current IT platform to integrate the deep learning algorithm, because this is something done at volume. You can't point and click every single image into a software or into a cloud. That would be very laborious. We had to obtain the regulatory clearance, and we had to prove to our National Screening Committee that the software meets our existing standard and does not compromise the current standard of care. And of course, we wanted to evaluate what was the most cost-effective model for integration. So when it came to the IT issues, we currently do have a telemedicine screening platform, and that's run on the government's internal healthcare cloud. And in the current system, images are taken at the site, held at the central server, and then returned back with a report. So we needed to integrate a process that allowed the images to be anonymized, sent up to a second server that was designed to handle deep learning tasks, because the requirements are quite different from what we had traditionally. The software would then run the artificial intelligence algorithm that assesses an outcome for these images, and the outcome had to be then relabeled with the identifier linked into this patient's electronic medical records, and then a report was generated that was a surrogate for the old report. They would be labeled as normal if these patients didn't have referable disease. If they did have referable disease, we wanted to route these back to the readers with an abnormal, with the findings of the AI, and allow the readers to then arbitrate. So when it came down to the regulatory issues in the Singapore market, we are regulated by the Health Sciences Authority, which considers this a medical device. There were a bunch of requirements that you needed to meet to prove that this software was able to meet the intended use. So in Singapore, fortunately, unfortunately, the bar for getting an artificial intelligence software approved does not require a prospective trial at the moment. I think regulatory needs will always change. We look at CE, didn't used to require it, but they may in the future. But the main hurdles for us were the fact that we were an academic institution. We did not have the expertise with dealing with ISO and all the software processes in the past. And the regulator actually told us straight out, an academic institution can't register software. You need a company that owns it. So eventually, we decided we were going to go for this regulatory goal, which would be a software that gives automated recommendations for referable disease for diabetic retinopathy as well as AMD and glaucoma suspect. And we had to create a company that would deal with all these processes for us. We've got the ISO, the HSA has been submitted a couple months ago, but it's still pending the final result, but all our consultations were positive. And we also, in spinning it off, got an agreement from the company to allow this software to be used within our healthcare system without a licensing fee for a very long, almost indefinite period, which allowed us to then provide care at a cheap rate for our local citizens, since this software was originally developed from grant funding. So the next thing we needed to do was actually implement this into our system, as well as gather the data that would prove to our national committee that this was an adequately accurate software. So we did it in first phase in 6 of our 18 polyclinics. And we wanted to look at 2 models. We were going to put the artificial intelligence here. We wanted to see if we were going to use artificial intelligence as the only source of grading, or we were going to keep our senior grader, our stage 2 of grading within our system. And of course, the thinking behind that was that perhaps the senior graders would be able to add an increased level of specificity, while at the same time not requiring that large human workload. So we designed a study that will compare 3 paths, humans only, using the DLS as an independent system, and having a secondary arbitration by a human grader. We did 2 parts of the study. In the first 2 weeks, all the images were regraded by 3 retinal specialists. We did not continue it for the full duration because we didn't have the resources to grade 20,000 images with retinal specialists. In the initial phase, when we compared the results of retinal specialists, we found our graders actually performed very similar to our retinal specialists. These are mostly experienced graders, more than 5 years experience, and they were trained to mimic what our retinal specialists had defined as disease, and the sensitivity and specificity was good. The AI in this real-world condition provided a pretty good sensitivity as well. There was a bit of a drop in the specificity compared to our retrospective study, and that's why it's very important to do prospective evaluation of your system. We also compared the AI to the graders, and the sensitivity ended up similar with a slight decrease in specificity. The interesting thing is that AI had a very good sensitivity for BTDR. So tiny neovascularizations that sometimes the graders may miss, the AI was not missing it. So each system had its pros and cons. And we then sent it through the second stage, where we did evaluate first with an AI, and then we looked at the graders then evaluating the images, and we found that by combining both, we were able to maintain a very high specificity and sensitivity with a 2-stage model. So we did health economic analysis, and we look at global healthcare costs. So not just the cost of screening, we look at the cost of then sending the patients to the specialists, and then doing the treatment and assessing the quality of life outcomes with vision or blindness avoided. And what we did find that because referring to an ophthalmologist in Singapore is very costly, we did find that a 2-tier, the 2-stage model actually had a slight cost savings over the purely automated model because we will be able to reduce the false positive rate. And at the same time, we would still be able to reduce our grader workload by about 70%, assuming we maintain the normal audit, even with a two-stage model. So in conclusion, we found that AI can be effectively implemented into an existing national DR telemedicine screening program. AI can provide similar accuracy and cost savings over a human grader-driven screening model. And when you have a system which already has a large pool of trained graders and the infrastructure in place, there may be consideration to use a model where you still use your senior graders to adjudicate scans, and because that may improve your or reduce false positive rate, that may still result in greater cost savings from reduced referrals. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the people who worked on our project together. Thank you.